Hi everyone. Uh, I had recorded a video earlier and something happened with it. It corrupted and it wouldn't go onto YouTube. So now I'm recording this again. I've figured out how to put me in this corner and also show you your lecture. So let's see how well this works. Okay, so welcome to our first real online lecture. And Again, I hope you guys are doing well and give me some feedback on how you're doing in class and how you're feeling about the rest of this semester. And I got your midterms and all of that and graded your midterms. I'm debating on whether to do short answer for your final or multiple choice. So let me know what you think about that, if you have any opinion on that. All right, so before the end of the semester, we have a couple of topics to go over, and they're actually my favorite topics in economic geography to talk about. So today we're going to talk about ethnic economies, and then next week we're going to talk about gender in economy. And with every lecture that I post, I'm going to post companion videos with it. So I posted 4 different TED Talks that go with this lecture. I want you to all watch them around the same time you're watching this lecture, because they all add to the whole idea that I'm trying to get at with ethnic economies. And I'll explain what an ethnic economy is in a minute if you don't know what I'm talking about. And the reflection of the screen on my glasses is pretty annoying. Okay, so we're going to talk ethnic economies. We're going to talk gender in economies. We're going to talk consumption and what we consume and why we consume it. And that's one of my favorite things to talk about because we so blindly consume things. It's one of the things that we allow ourselves to kind of get sucked into without really thinking about why we're doing it. So I really like to shed light on why we're doing why we feel the need to buy certain things like diamonds um, or a whole other load of stuff that we think that we need to buy in our life. Um, and then I'm going to do a case study on a couple of different countries. So I'll spend a week talking about Mexico and why Mexico's economy is the way that it is, and what a lot of the issues are in Mexico when it comes to their economy. They haven't always been poor. In fact, they're not that poor compared to the rest of the world. They're not that poor compared to their neighbors to the south. And there is a lot happening in their economy right now that tends to focus on what isn't the real problem. So I'll talk about that when we get to Mexico. And then I'm going to talk about Ethiopia. I'll have a lecture on Ethiopia and again go through Ethiopia and look at why their economy is where it is and how it is the fastest growing economy in Africa since 2010 and where they're going to be in the next couple of years. Okay, so that's the remainder of our topics for this semester: ethnic economies, gender, consumption. We're going to look at Mexico and how Mexico's economy's evolved and what's going on with it now. And then the same thing with Ethiopia. And then we're done. All right. So this lecture also goes with the movie that I made you watch this week, the one that you had your quiz on, which was 13th, which I know you all watched, but it's about mass incarceration and how mass incarceration really favors people of color, not favors in a nice way. Okay, so ethnic economies. I thought this was a good quote. Leonard Cohen, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in, you know, because global pandemic. And then I have extra credit for you all before the end of the semester. So breaking free is about the queer community in India. Yeah, watch that. India is a very conservative country and it is very difficult to be queer there. So breaking free. Period, end of sentence is a very short documentary. It's only like 24 minutes. It won best short documentary last year. It is very good. It's about getting your period in India and what that means, how much of a sense of shame there is, what that means for an individual's economy, what that means for going to school when you get your period and you can't afford maxi pads, that means that you drop out of school. And that's one of the reasons we see huge discrepancies in girls going to school versus boys going to school. And yeah, so watch that. I'm Not Your Negro is about James Baldwin and his life. Check it out. Grass is Greener is about weed and the economy of weed, but also how weed has been linked for a long time culturally to music, especially to jazz. And then Waiting for Superman. If we were in class, we would watch this in class. This is one of the movies that I like to watch in class. This and Chris Rock's Good Hair, but I can't show them now since here we are, and there's copyright issues if I show them like over YouTube or whatever. So Waiting for Superman, I'll give you as extra credit, and it's about our school system. And it has to do with a lot of the themes that we're talking about in this last section of the class. Okay, so we've got our extra credit down. We've got the question about whether you want to do a short answer or multiple choice for your midterm. And then also you have one more quiz, and your one more quiz is on another documentary, a third documentary. Okay, so what is when we're talking about an ethnic economy, it doesn't necessarily, that can mean a whole lot of different things. We're going to talk about different ideas that go behind an ethnic economy, like an ethnoburb, et cetera, et cetera. But first I want to start with the idea that we tend to think of the economy as colorblind, just like we tend to think of the economy as this whole other thing. Remember, we talked about, and that movie, The 11th Hour, showed how we think of the economy over here and nature over here, and the 11th Hour really spoke to how the economy is a subsystem within the environment. So we have to stop thinking about them as different. But we tend to think about the economy in its own little realm instead of connected to everything, which of course it is. It's going to be connected to culture. It's going to be connected to the environment. It's going to be connected to politics. I mean, it's not its own individual system. And so we tend to think that the economy, because it is completely untouched by culture and humanity, that it's colorblind, that it doesn't take into account gender, that it doesn't take into account different parts of our personality that might not have anything to do with our labor, our ability to work. We tend to think of employees as a unit of labor. And so if you're just a unit of labor, what matters is you what matters is the labor that you put in, right? We have this ideology in the US that you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And if, would you stop it? If you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, it has to do with your own integrity. It has to do with your individual moxie. And as long as you work very hard, and as long as you, you know, work with integrity and work honestly, you should be able to succeed, at least in our economy. There's this great quote from Martin Luther King where he says something like, how can you expect someone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps when they have no boots? So I want us to question the idea of colorblindness, and colorblindness is its own very, very loaded term. You know, that was a term that was made popular once again by Martin Luther King. It was used in his most famous speech, and a lot of people kind of took it and ran with it. And they took that idea to mean, yeah, we should ignore color. We should just stop talking about color. In fact, I had a person in this class a year ago when I was giving this lecture who said, yeah, we should stop talking about color. If we stop talking about race and racism, then racism will go away. Well, maybe for him, because he was not a person of color, and he was a cisgendered, heteronormative white male. So if he stopped talking about all these issues, then yeah, they might go away for him, but they don't go away for other people who are affected by them. So a lot of people took this idea of colorblindness as we don't have to talk about what makes us uncomfortable in society anymore. And that's not what Martin Luther King Jr. meant by that. And that's really not something that can actually be applied. You know, if you're truly colorblind, like I've had people tell me that they're colorblind. I had somebody tell me that the other day. was talking to somebody over Zoom, and they said that they're trying to get away from distinguishing people by color. And the thing is if you pretend to not see color, you're doing just that. You're pretending. I mean, we know that you can see color. Otherwise, how do you know when to stop and go at a stoplight or something like that? So it's the same thing with people. The idea is to not ignore color. The idea is to talk about how color has affected us. And only when we can talk about it and purge our society and really understand how it's affecting us can we actually get to a point where it no longer matters. And that's what Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about in his speech, to get to a point where it doesn't really matter what color we are in terms of how far we can get in life, what education we can attain, where we can buy a house, all of that kind of stuff. So he wasn't so much saying, let's just not talk about this anymore so it goes away so we don't have to make ourselves uncomfortable. He was talking about, let's talk about it and purge ourselves of these racist institutions so that we can get to a point where we no longer have to worry about what color we are. And it can just be something interesting, like that your hair is red versus your hair is black. If my dog is snoring behind me, if you can't see her and she starts snoring behind me, it's not me just falling asleep during my own lecture. Okay, so does ethnicity shape our economy? And especially we could look at how it shapes us. We could look at how ethnicity shapes us in so many different ways. First, beginning of the semester, we talked about how ethnicity can affect us with things like, we talked about hair a little bit, and how if you are a person from a marginalized society who lives in a dominant society, and in order to assimilate into that dominant society, you attempt to look as much like that dominant society as possible. So if that dominant society is all about straight hair and I have very, very curly hair, well, what lengths am I going to go to straighten my hair so I can fit in, so I can try to assimilate, so I can get a job, so I can look professional? So often, like, it's not so much about your hair is too ethnic, it's your hair just doesn't look professional the way that it grows naturally out of your head. So we talked about that earlier in the semester. If you remember, the beginning of the semester, I showed a video about names, and it was called a Roshanda by Any Other Name. And it was about how you have people with like identical resumes, but with a black sounding name and a white sounding name, and how the black sounding name Tyrone got many more rejection letters, and a person with a black sounding name would be out of work for about 15 weeks versus a person with a white sounding name would be out of work for about 10 weeks. And that's a very long time to be unemployed. 5 extra weeks. So ethnicity can shape us in how people perceive us. If we have certain names, if we have certain hairstyles, if we have certain clothes or dress that associate us with a certain ethnicity, that can affect us. But I have here how ethnicity shapes our urban economy specifically. And I want to talk about this because this is a really important part of institutionalized racism that we don't talk or understand that much about, because it's very, very subtle. It's much more overt to look at things like Jim Crow laws in the past, racist laws in the past that like specifically said Black people cannot use these bathrooms, or Black people can't sit at this counter or something like that. And it gets a lot murkier when we get into what happens in urban areas, especially in the post-World War II era. So I want to talk a little bit about that in order to understand the idea of intergenerational wealth. So intergenerational wealth, if you haven't heard that term before, it's exactly what it sounds like. Anytime you have something that is intergenerational, it's something that goes from generation to generation to generation. So let's say you have property that your grandparents owned, or your great grandparents, and your great grandparents possibly profited off of that property. They might have bought it for like a tiny amount of money compared to what they sold it for 20, 30 years later. They would have maybe used that profit from that house to help their child buy a house, to help their child go to college, so their child isn't in a whole lot of debt, so their child is able to get their own kind of middle class safety net, and then that passes down generation to generation to generation. And so when we talk about intergenerational wealth, this is one of the ways that we don't necessarily see how ethnicity can shape intergenerational wealth. So I want to talk about that. And that especially comes about in urban economies and in urban enclaves and suburbs and in cities and stuff like that. And it has to do with policies that were created during World War II and in the post World War II era that specifically allowed certain people to buy houses and other people to not buy houses. So we want to talk about how urban economies have been shaped in the past and how it continues to shape us. Okay, so we have ideas, or not ideas, we have two terms, de facto and de jure. So de facto and de jure. And if you don't know what those mean, de facto is something that, de facto means, I can't remember what it means right now, but de facto means that it's done, damn it, one is by law and one is by practice. De facto must be by practice. So de facto means by practice, meaning that it's kind of like how women get married and most of them change their name. Only 23% of women, or actually it's even less now, I think it's like 17% of women in the US don't change their name when they get married. So why do we change our name when we get married? Because it's normal, because it's traditional. That's kind of a de facto ideology in society, if that makes sense. There's no law, there's nothing that says that you have to do that, but a whole lot of us do it because it's kind of the norm. So that would be an example of something that's de facto as opposed to de jure, which is by law, which is you have to do it because it's the law, right? So we often think about segregation. We often think about racism in the economy as being de facto by practice, like especially if you look at different cities and you see how cities are like, and I'm not talking about southern cities, cities all over the US can be divided by color lines, where if we were to look at Seattle, if we were to look at San Francisco, I have a map of San Francisco in just a minute. If we were to look at Chicago, if we were to look at our major cities around the country, you would see very specific lines of like Black people live here, Chinese people live here, white people live here, Jewish people live here. And there's reasons for that. And some of those reasons are historical, things like when people moved into a certain area and the way that migration patterns tend to work. And some of them are from de jure practices from the government, specifically separating people. But we tend to think of that type of segregation today as de facto, like we just chose to all live close to the people that we look like. And for a long time, that's what I thought too. And then I read this book called Evicted, and then The Color of Law. And both of those books talk specifically about how there was all these policies that were put in place to specifically separate people in cities based on race. And that gave me a lot of relief for some reason to know. I mean, not a relief to know that our government had created these racist policies, but it gave me relief to know that we didn't just segregate naturally, that's something that's actually imposed on us. So when we talk about urban economies, and we talk about living in cities and how different cities have been segregated, so there's a couple of different ways. One is redlining. If you've never heard of redlining before, it has to do with how banks determine different areas of a city and like whether that area has value or not. And of course, a bank is a business, and a bank is giving out huge amounts of money. It's loaning huge amounts of money, and they need to make sure that those gigantic, enormous sums of money are going to be paid back to them. So there's a lot of different ways that they go about doing that. They assess things like what kind of a job you have, what kind of a credit history you have. Do you have a history of paying things back when you borrow them? Do you have a job that's going to keep you employed and keep you with regular pay and possibly with a pension so that you can pay this back? And then there's other things that the bank wants to take into consideration. They don't want to loan a whole lot of money for you to buy a house right next to the freeway, or for you to buy a house in a flood zone or something like that, because they are not possibly going to see a return on that much money. So redlining, the idea that banks decided, okay, this is where we're going to loan this much money, and this is where we're going to loan that much money. A lot of it has to do with just the business of being the bank. But then there's this other part of redlining where you had different government policies that specifically created lines in places like Los Angeles, for example, in places like St. Louis is a big one, in Chicago, that specifically said, in this part of the city, that's the part of the city that Black people can live in. This is the part of the city that white people can live in. So there was a couple of different laws that led to this. There was segregation of public housing projects that happened in the Great Depression. The Great Depression, you had all of these great programs that were created by Roosevelt, the WPA. There was these housing programs that were created, but the public housing projects that came out of the Great Depression were created specifically for white people. So in the beginning, Black people were not allowed to be housed in these emergency housing, public housing projects, even though, everybody was out of work during the Great Depression. That's just one small example, and you might be hearing this and thinking, oh, well, that's public housing projects from the 1930s, but that's just one example of how we've had government implemented segregation. In 1910 in Baltimore, that's the first city to implement laws that specifically told people where they could live within a city boundary. Now, that doesn't mean that places weren't segregated before that, but that would have been more de facto segregation. Like, you don't live on that side of the town because people are going to burn your house down if you live there type of segregation. But Baltimore 1910, that's the first place where we have actually written laws that create this segregated redlining of the city. And then a really big part, so the Buchanan decision. The Buchanan decision was also the adoption of zoning laws that kept apartment buildings out of suburbs. So I'm going to come back to the Buchanan decision in just a minute, but a big part of how we see segregation right now in cities started around World War II. Okay, so World War II was enormous for so many different reasons, and it caused all kinds of changes. It got us out of the Great Depression. It restructured the economy of the US so that the US came out as one of the superpowers in the world, this gigantic economy. And it's when we start to see the real growth of our middle class, for one. And it's also where we see like a whole lot of people moving around. So people have always moved around inside the US, and people move around for all kinds of reasons anywhere, either from country to country or inside a country. It usually has to do with things like job opportunities. If you live in a place that you don't have a lot of job opportunities, you're going to go to the place where there are job opportunities. But then you have other factors too. From 1920 to 1940, and then 1940 to 1960, you have the Great Migrations. So the Great Migrations are specifically referring to the movement of African Americans from the South to places like Detroit, New York, Chicago, and California. And the push factor there would have been, you're Black and living in the South in 1920, right? You could be lynched, you could be murdered, and there's going to be no accountability for it. So the push factor was definitely that. And the pull factor to places like Chicago, to places like New York, Detroit, was jobs. That's where industry was happening. That's where so much of the Harlem Renaissance happens in the 1920s. You have artists and musicians who are pulled into New York. Chicago had a bustling economy. And then California, you have a lot of Black people who start to come in here in World War II because there are so many jobs in industry that open up. California became this powerhouse for industry during World War II because we're right on the Pacific. So much of World War II was fought in the Pacific theater. So the boats, the munitions, all of the things that we needed to fight that war in the Pacific were built here in California. So you had a whole lot of people coming into California. In Los Angeles, after the war started until 1944, so just within 3 years, 250,000 Black people moved into Los Angeles alone, like just that one city. And they were only allowed to move into 2 different neighborhoods because of redlining. So because of these government implemented policies, and a lot of them were unconstitutional, these zoning ordinances that were pushed by cities, like Los Angeles had a zoning ordinance that implemented this whole idea that Black people could only move into Compton and into South Central. Well, it was unconstitutional, but that doesn't mean that it didn't exist. That doesn't mean that the city still didn't enforce it. So when we look at a place like Los Angeles, and we see that South Central and Compton are two very uh, their their demographic is changing right now, but for the last several decades, they've been places that have been primarily African American, primarily Black, and a big part of that is because of where people were allowed to move into. And then the second big part, because you might be thinking World War II was a long time ago, so why didn't people move? And they don't have those redlining laws anymore. So another big part of it was the GI Bill. And the GI Bill has so much to do with our middle class, and it has so much to do with our intergenerational wealth. So the GI Bill, if you're not aware, started in World War II. And it was this great, great program that gave GIs, people who served in the military, access to subsidized loans for college, subsidized mortgages so that they could buy a house. It's what it's what changed the US in so many different ways, because what happens is you have all these service people who come back from World War II and they're able to go to college. Whereas they would have been working in factories most of their life. They would have come back from the war and worked in factories. Now you had a lot of people who went to college, and so we created this educated workforce. Plus, the US gave them subsidized mortgages so that people were able to afford houses. Okay, so that's all great. And that's what allowed, if you look at the 1950s and you see the beginning of so much that happened here in the US, like the beatnik, bohemian art. I mean, look at the books that really start being written in the 1950s in the US. Look at the art that starts in the 1950s in the US. That a huge part of that is because you have people who otherwise would have been working in factories who got to go to college because of the GI Bill, and then got to become Jack Kerouac as opposed to a factory worker. So so that was great. But in order to really enjoy those benefits, you mostly had to be a white male. So women were in the military. Oh, like women were all over the military. I know that they weren't fighting in action, but men who got the GI Bill weren't necessarily in at the front lines either. You had men who were working in technology, who were working in like coding, who were all part of the military, who received benefits, the GI Bill. But any woman who was in the military, and you had women who were coding, you had women who were working as secretaries, who were working as nurses, who were working as all kinds of different things, they were all considered volunteers. So none of them were eligible for the GI Bill. So none of them, even though they had served in the military as well, and in many ways in the same capacity as the men, because a lot of people might be thinking right now, like, well, yeah, but they didn't fight, they weren't in combat. Not everybody who was in the war who was male was in combat either, and they got the GI Bill. So what happens is you have women who don't get to take advantage of the subsidized loans for college or the subsidized loans for mortgages. And then the other part of that is you had Black GIs, and about 1 million Black GIs were denied those same benefits as well. And they were denied them in a couple of different ways. One, they were the subsidized loans. So the GI Bill definitely allowed for a lot of African American servicemen coming back from World War II to go to college for sure, but not to buy houses. And so that was for a couple of reasons, or to buy houses in cities that were going to start to crumble. So let me explain why that was. So, okay. So the way that the GI Bill worked is you had these subsidies for mortgages, and of course the bank has to approve the mortgages, and you had unconstitutional zoning, like I talked about, in cities, that meant that banks wouldn't allow Black people or people of color to buy houses in different parts of the city, for one. But then also you had the suburbs. The movement of people from cities to suburbs gets going after World War II as well. So after World War II, you have the creation of the first suburb, that's Leventon. That's in New York. That was segregated. You weren't allowed to move there unless you were white. And then you have, like, Chicago became this center for different suburbs. And a suburb, if you don't know, is a suburban satellite area, right? So the urban would be the center of the economy, and the suburban allowed you to live outside of the city and still commute and benefit from the economy of the city. And a lot of people wanted to leave cities at that time because cities were dirty at that time. You might think cities are dirty now, not nearly as dirty as they were then, because you had industrial waste. You didn't have the EPA. You didn't have any sort of laws on like what was being dumped into rivers, what was being pushed into the sky from these factories that would have been in Chicago or New York or places like that. So you wanted to leave the city because it was a pretty filthy place to be. So you have these government subsidized mass production of suburbs. And the condition for the government to subsidize these suburbs, the creation of these suburbs in all these cities around the US, was that only white people can move into them. And they did that for a couple of different ways. They did that by the government and banks had to okay the subsidized mortgages. And so if you were Black, you were not okayed for a subsidized mortgage in suburbs. You were okayed for subsidized mortgages in cities. Um, the suburbs weren't allowed to build um, apartment buildings. You weren't allowed to have apartment buildings in them. That was more of a class thing, like trying to grow a middle class enclave versus a lower class enclave, staying back in the city, if that makes sense. And my God, Gingy. And then that brings in the Buchanan decision, which was a Supreme Court decision that essentially adopted zoning laws, keeping apartments out of suburbs, keeping keeping this system of redlining intact. Okay, so I hope you're getting an idea of how, even though World War II was a long time ago, how that set in motion a whole lot that still affects us today. Because imagine that you're a serviceman who comes back from World War II. Now you get to go to college. You go to let's say that you go to the University of Chicago, or you go to the Chicago Institute of Art, both great schools. And now you have, you either study art or you study humanities or you study whatever, engineering. And now you have somebody who has a college education and they get a good job, and banks are like, yay, you're a great investment. You're going to get a subsidized mortgage, so you're going to be able to afford a house. You're white, so you're going to be able to move into one of the suburbs outside of Chicago. And now you have a house, a college education, and you are set up for, as long as you work for it, a pretty good life. Now think about what happens with the next generation. The next generation, now you own your house. The property value has gone up. You could sell it and buy a little condo somewhere else, and then give a portion of that money to your kids so they can buy their own house. Now your kids are able to like build their own nest egg, and then it goes on generation by generation by generation. As opposed to if you're a Black serviceman coming back from World War II, and okay, you get to go to college, that's great. But you're trying to buy a house, and you can get a subsidized mortgage possibly in a city. Okay, so now I'm going to buy inside a city. I'm going to buy in Brooklyn. I'm going to buy in Chicago. All right, that's not bad. I mean, today we all want to live in Brooklyn and Chicago. I mean, not me, but people do. Okay, so that doesn't sound so bad, right? Except that what happens with that white flight, so that movement of people out of the cities and specifically white people into suburbs, is referred to as white flight. And what they take with them is their tax base. So they take their tax base with them. And as you probably know, but just in case, schools are tied to the tax base of their neighborhood. So if you live in a wealthy neighborhood, your school is going to get a whole lot of money. And that's why here in Santa Barbara, we have huge discrepancies in our schools. So Cold Springs is a school in Montecito. My stepkids went there. The average classroom was like 15 to 20 kids. And I remember they asked us for their suggested PTA donation for the year was $15,000. That was the PTA donation. This is a free public school, And they were like, everybody gives about $15,000 to this school. 2 miles away is Franklin School, and Franklin is the worst school in Santa Barbara when it comes to right now. They have a I don't want to ignore the principal and all that she's done, because the principal has done extremely innovative things at Franklin. But Franklin is dealing with a whole lot of challenges because it is in such a poor neighborhood, and that poor neighborhood being the Lower East Side, right? Like behind Vaughn's, or not Vaughn's, Trader Joe's on Milpas. So if you look at those two schools, they're only a couple of miles away from each other. And you have kids who are going to grow up in the same community and who hopefully will give back to the same community, but they're receiving a very different level of education. And you might say, yeah, well, that's because their parents have more money and the tax base, and they pay more to go to live in those houses in Montecito and blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, what it's doing is it's shooting us in the foot for our next generation. Because if we only think about our kids and the education our kids are getting, then we're not thinking about what's good for our entire community and what's going to happen to us in the next generation if we have only a few people who are educated versus people who aren't. So we have white flight that happens with this post World War II suburban movement of white people. And we also start to see the crumbling of industry. So factories stay pretty strong, but factories start to move out. Um, they really start to move out in the 1960s and the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, they're pretty much all gone to Mexico or to China or to Southeast Asia or somewhere like that. But we start to see the crumbling of our industry. And industry, unions and other organizations like that allowed for industry to stay pretty strong for a while. It's one of the reasons that you can have somebody who has a high school education living off of a pension right now, in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, which is right outside of Pittsburgh, or somewhere in Michigan or something like that. It's because they would have gotten a good union job in a factory in Pittsburgh throughout the 1960s and the 1970s. But uh, but you also saw the city just start to crumble. They started to lose their city jobs, right? And then because of that tax base left, because the educated tax base left with and went to the suburbs, you started to see the schools crumble. And so with the schools kind of like lowering and lowering and lowering in quality from the 1950s on in cities, and then you see the militarization of a lot of police forces in different parts of the country, like in Oakland, like in Los Angeles, like in Chicago, where the people in the cities are seen as the threat, right? Instead of protecting them, they're seen as like the people that we have to control. And so that whole combination of things leads to, okay, maybe me as a Black serviceman was able to buy a house in Chicago, but now the south side of Chicago is nothing compared to what it was in the 1950s. In the 1950s, buying a house in the south side of Chicago, you were buying it in a pretty nice ethnic enclave. And by now, you're buying it in a place that Spike Lee called Chirac. And I don't think it's just Spike Lee who called it that, but yeah. So does that make sense when it comes to intergenerational wealth? You're not selling your house and giving your children a nest egg. They're not gaining off of that and gaining a nice middle class life and passing that on to their children. See the way that affects you. Okay, so when we look at ethnicity and how it shapes urban economies, that's one of the ways. That's one of the ways where we say like, oh, but the economy is colorblind. As long as you work really hard, then you should be fine. Except that discrepancies in the GI Bill, except that redlining, except that different laws and zoning ordinances that were illegal were still implemented by cities that kept some people in this part of the city and some people in that part of the city. And then banks wouldn't loan to this part of the city. They saw this part of the city, they saw Black neighborhoods as neighborhoods that were bad bets. So those neighborhoods started to lose their businesses. And when they started to lose their businesses, that's really the kiss of death that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But and then they started building freeways through those cities. So if you look at major Black neighborhoods in major cities around the country, those are exactly the neighborhoods that freeways started to be built through. So if you look at South Central, for example, South Central and Compton used to be like a continuous part of the Los Angeles basin, but now there are two freeways that come and separate and divide that specific part of the city. And yeah, so you have this geographic division, but then you also have the lowering of your property value because now you bought a house and it's next to a freeway. So, and if you have any questions about everything that I just said, then please let's talk about it. Okay, so we have the sorting of the workforce so that certain ethnic groups are disproportionately concentrated in particular jobs. And that can happen with all the stuff that I just explained, from loans, subsidized loans that favor one ethnicity that send them to certain types of colleges versus subsidized loans that send people to like tech schools or trade schools. That's one way that you can have sorting. There's other ways that you can have sorting of ethnicities into certain particular jobs. It could be, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example, and all I can think of are Jewish people, but it could be something like you have trying to think, you have we've talked about Black people's hair, and we earlier in the semester, and the assimilation of Black women especially into a culture that favors straight hair. And so think about the salons and the businesses that are going to be focused around that. That's not necessarily the best example because it's like an example of oppression within like economic growth. So it's like, yay, people are making money off of of this like oppressive assimilation. But you get the idea. So there are certain jobs that you might do just because you know the ethnicity, like what is going to be needed within that ethnicity. And there's other reasons that you might have disproportionately concentrated people in different jobs. Like, for example, if you are not aware of the idea of like Chinese people in laundry, so that you have a lot of Chinese laundromats, not so much anymore, but back in the day you did for sure. And a big part of that was because Chinese people came here. I mean, Chinese people have come here over and over and over again, but a huge group of Chinese people came here during the gold rush. And during the gold rush, you had all kinds of laws that separated Chinese people from other people. Taxes, different disproportionate taxes on Chinese laborers, and uh, um, the alien land law didn't allow Chinese people to buy land in California for a long time. All of that kind of stuff. That's another reason that you might see some sort of division. If your ethnicity and your nationality was specifically excluded from even being able to stay here and get a green card and get citizenship. So, so you had these Chinese people who because they were separated in so many ways because of the law, they also started to create businesses that served that group because no other businesses would serve them, right? So like if you have restaurants that are there for the minors, but they exclude Chinese people, then you have Chinese people who go into restaurants that serve just Chinese people. And it was the same thing with laundry. But Chinese laundries really, really took off in San Francisco. Something about you know, I don't know, preference of how your laundry was done, and a high concentration of Chinese people in San Francisco. And so you had this stereotype that then is associated with Chinese people in laundry, and it has a reason. It has this reason, this historical reason, this divisional reason. If you ever go get your nails done in California, chances are the person who did your nails is Vietnamese. And the reason that they're Vietnamese it has to do with Vietnamese refugees. And you had about 2 million people who left Vietnam after World War II, not World War II, the Vietnam War. And a lot of them came here. And they were sent to different refugee camps. And one of the major refugee camps was in San Jose. So in San Jose, you have this whole group of Vietnamese refugees. And Jane Fonda was she's an actress, but she was a political activist during the Vietnam War. And she went to this refugee camp, and she essentially started this training for Vietnamese women to do nails. It's a business that is really, really good for an immigrant. It has very low overhead. So she started this technical training program for Vietnamese women that started like Vietnamese women doing nails. And that has just spread to where now you see like new Vietnamese immigrants who come in and get into that business because that's the ethnic niche. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of different ways that you can have this sorting. And some of them are some of them are historical, some of them are kind of coincidental, some of them are because you have history of people being ghettoized and discluded and marginalized, and then they end up serving their group. Like Jews, for example, in Europe, Jews in Europe have been discriminated for a very long time. It wasn't just Hitler. So they it has to do with money, which I described before World War. I'm sorry, before our first midterm. I talked about how you have, if you have the reason that like Jewish people were separated in Europe, it had to do with banking and all of that stuff that we talked about. So then you have Jewish people who are the only bankers in Europe because of the reasons we talked about before the midterm. And people really, really don't like paying interest, right? So they started to marginalize Jewish people more and more and more. And they said, okay, well, now you can't live in this part of, you can only live in this part of the city and nowhere else. Okay, so now Jewish people are all living in the same neighborhood. And they, all their Jewish businesses are in that neighborhood too, and they all frequent each other's businesses. So all that money continues to circulate inside their Jewish community. And then people in the rest of Europe are like, okay, now you can't go to colleges, now you can't become doctors, now you can't like reach this level of education, again forcing them further and further into banking and jewelry and keeping the money inside their Jewish businesses. So that's another reason you might have people concentrated in particular jobs. Okay, and then the spatial patterning of urban landscapes so that businesses owned by certain ethnic groups tend to cluster. That's for everything I was explaining about. That has to do with everything I was explaining about the GI Bill and stuff like that. And it also has to do with how you have people who cluster for different reasons. I've been talking about zoning a whole lot, but I'm going to switch over and talk about different immigrant groups in just a minute. And this is what I talked about already, that we have this absence of ethnic identity and conventional economic analysis, even though we really shouldn't. Okay, so here is the Bay Area. We've got San Francisco. San Francisco looks like a little thumb up here. San Francisco, by the way, is the only city and county in the US. And then we have all these bridge and tunnel places. Sorry, I lived in San Francisco for 10 years, so I can say that. Oakland, Berkeley, Piedmont. Piedmont is fancy Oakland. Alameda down here. And then Fremont. Ooh, has anybody read The Kite Runner? That's where he moves after he leaves Afghanistan. Sorry, spoiler. And all these different places. Okay, so what we're looking at are Chinese enclaves. So the dark black are Chinese enclaves. And you can see that, I mean, Chinese people are all over the Bay Area, but you can see that they're specifically sorted into different parts of the Bay Area. And that has to do with a whole lot of different reasons. So that should be Chinatown. That looks kind of big for Chinatown, but yeah, that should be Chinatown. This is the Sunset. This is the Richmond district. And so Chinatown is where Chinese people moved when San Francisco was just getting started as a city and during the gold rush. And like I said, there was a lot of exclusionary laws that were placed on Chinese people, which pushed them into this little neighborhood. And then what tends to happen with immigrants is you have these little enclaves of immigrants. And so let's say if you've ever worked in a restaurant or something like that, you'll talk to like the people who work in the kitchen, and they probably all come from one country, and not just from one country, but from like one city in that country. Like they all come from the exact same place, like some small town in Mexico or some small town in Guadalajara. That's in Mexico. I meant to say Guatemala, or some small town in the Philippines or something like that. It's because somebody moves here, they get a job, they get an apartment, and then their cousin moves, and their cousin knows that they can move here because they already have a cousin who has a job and has an apartment, and they'll help them get a job. And then you have these little clusters that come in. So that's why Chinatown would have continued to grow even after exclusionary laws were kind of taken away. It's because new Chinese immigrants would have been like, oh, that's where the Chinese people are. And then these two major Chinese communities in San Francisco got going after the People's Revolution. So after the People's Revolution, so this was sand, basically. This part of San Francisco was like all sand. And San Francisco, when San Francisco started, it was just like this big. In fact, the Haight-Ashbury, which is out here, was a vacation community to people in San Francisco. I mean, it's like right in the middle of the city now, but that's how far away it was from the central business district. So people couldn't figure out how to build on this sand. And so what they finally did is they grew ice plants. Ice plant is a species of plant from South Africa. I'm sorry, I'm tired. And it'll grow anywhere. So basically they grew it all across the sand that was this part of San Francisco. And once they could grow that on top of it, they could put soil on top of it, and then they started to build on top of it. And that didn't really happen until like right around World War II. And so you have this whole like new part of San Francisco that's being built right when the People's Revolution is happening, and people are just like fleeing China. And so many of those people came and settled right in here. So when we have different enclaves of, let's say, Chinese people, it's for different reasons. Sometimes you have like an exclusionary history. Sometimes you have a history of mass migration because people are fleeing a war. They're fleeing some sort of a famine. Does that make sense? Okay. So our ethnic clusters, many ethnic minorities, smaller groups of people within a larger majority, have responded to marginalization by establishing their own commercial neighborhoods. And that's definitely something you see with Chinese people, or with Korean people, or with all kinds of other people, where now you have cultural differences with Chinese people that might not assimilate nearly as easily as like Portuguese and Spanish people. If you have like Spanish immigrants coming in, and then you have Portuguese immigrants coming in. I mean, they definitely know that they're different. They're from different countries and they speak different languages, but they're Catholic. They have like some historical something in common, et cetera, et cetera. When you have a culture as diverse from European culture as Chinese culture, then that's one of the reasons that you might start to see more of an opportunity for specifically ethnic businesses, because you're serving like a specific, you're serving something that's not necessarily common in the rest of that culture. That makes sense. So these entrepreneurial processes, ways that you kind of like, and I'm trying to think, all I can think of are restaurants and laundry, but I know that there's different there's different things that certain people, I don't know. And then I can think of like mahjong. There are certain things that that within an ethnicity, within a community, like, oh, like a business opportunity that people from outside that ethnic community might not know. If you can think of any examples of this, this would be a great way to participate. All right, so we have these major immigrant cities or neighborhoods, or major immigrant cities like San Francisco. I mean, any city in the US is an immigrant city. We're a country of immigrants, unless you're indigenous American. But so our cities, one of the reasons that they're kind of sorted ethnically, besides those reasons that I said earlier with racism and et cetera, is also because you have these pockets of people who came here at different times. If we go to some of the different neighborhoods in Chicago, you're going to find distinctly Jewish neighborhoods. That's because Jewish people were getting kicked out of Russia, and the place where you could get a job at that time was Chicago. That's where like all the meat packing was. That's where there was a whole lot of work for people who were willing to work. And the Russian pogroms that pushed Jewish people out of Russia, a whole lot of them ended up in Chicago, and then they end up living close to each other because your cousin is already there, and they can help you get a place to live, and they can help you get a job. Jesus, are you just back here licking yourself? Stop, stop, stop it, stop it. Don't look at me like that. She was licking her foot. Okay, so you have like different communities inside immigrant cities because of the way that immigrants tend to move at similar times because they're getting pushed out of their country for some reason. Like we have a lot of Swedish people in Wisconsin and Minnesota and places like that. And a big reason is because there was a famine and a whole lot of war that happened in the 1860s and 1870s in Sweden and Norway. So people were running away from Sweden and Norway, and the kind of open area at the time, the area of opportunity, the place where you could kind of easily move in, maybe get some land, maybe get some work, was Minnesota and the Dakotas and places like that. So bippity boppity boo, you've got a whole lot of people who are Norwegian and Swedish in ancestry. So our immigrant cities now have distinctive Chinatowns, Koreatown, Little India. Where's there a Little India? Little Singapore. Oh, Little India in Singapore. I was trying to think of where there would be a Little India in the US. Yeah, that makes sense, Singapore. So ethnic business clusters, we have different ways of referring to ethnic business clusters. We have ethnoburbs. Those are often not marginalized spaces because of like ghettoization, meaning that people weren't forced into those ethnoburbs for whatever reason, either the reason of, like I talked about, Jewish people in Europe earlier, or Black people in different parts of the US, but they're actually thriving concentrations of ethnic businesses. And you have different banks like working within your community that are specifically like, oh, I know what that idea is. Because just imagine if you bring an idea that only your ethnicity would know to a bank outside of that, and you're like, hey, I want to start this thing. I'm trying to think of something. I'm Australian, so I don't really have a whole lot of culture, and I'm Jewish, but I've already talked so much about Jews. So what's another good example? Something that like you would know inside your culture, but if you went to like the bank of the majority and you said, hey, I want to start this business for blah blah blah, and they're like, what? That's not a business. And you're like, yeah, it's major business in my community. So if you have a bank that's working inside your community that knows the same thing you know, when in terms of business opportunity and stuff like that, then that's where you get that center of finance. And so an ethnoburb is not a ghetto. An ethnoburb is not a place where you have like where people have been marginalized and pushed to the side of a city. That's usually a thriving place, like Glendale. Isn't Glendale full of Armenians? Okay. An agglomeration economy, I've said that word before in class, but that's where you have clustering of businesses. Now, an agglomeration economy can be something like Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley going from San Jose to San Francisco. We know that that's all about tech. And there's a lot of different things that go into tech. You need like a graphic designer, you need a semiconductor designer, you need a hardware designer, all those people, and they have to be clustered in order for them to create this end product. Same thing with Hollywood. Hollywood is making movies, but you have all these different things that go into movies. You have the screenwriter and the director and the actors and the costume designer and the makeup artists and the et cetera, et cetera. All of those have to be close to each other in order for that economy to work. That's not true of every economy, but that's true of an agglomeration economy. But an agglomeration economy can also be something that has to do with ethnicity. You can also agglomerate, collect together, because your businesses make sense inside that ethnic community, if that makes sense. So otherism can be an issue with this, that spatial clustering can increase closure of an ethnic economy. So like maybe we all moved to the same neighborhood because we were protected there, and like we knew the kind of food that we wanted to eat, the kind of laundry that we wanted to go to, the grocery stores that sold our kind of food were all in this neighborhood, and that was great. But after a while, it can create this kind of closure where now that ethnic economy is so closed off that that it that it's closed off, that it's closed. That's the word I'm looking for. Uh, so that can be an issue. Um, and then at the further extreme, you have an ethnic enclave economy that involves a collection of entirely intra-ethnic. So intra as opposed to inter. So intra, they're working together, right? Um, and that can lead to closure as well, but it can also lead to, I don't know, some kind of like tourist industry. Good things, the ethnic economy is seen as providing opportunities and support, especially for new immigrants. But the negative is that you can see like marginalization, you can see poor wages, uh, all of that kind of stuff. Maybe like a lack of desire for banks to invest in your neighborhood because they see it as a bad investment because it's full of people who maybe just moved here and they're not sure of the return on their investment and stuff like that. Really big problem in an ethnic enclave is when you don't own your own businesses, and that's so much of what happened with the Black community. So you had Black owned businesses for a long time in the Black community, but you had a couple of different reasons that Black owned businesses sort of disappeared. One of them was banks' unwillingness to lend to people in zoned areas and redlined areas. So if a redlined area was decided to be a bad investment because it was a Black neighborhood, then banks wouldn't lend to people who wanted to start a business in that neighborhood. So what happened is you had this concentration of people, let's say Black people in Chicago and Southside Chicago, who then stopped seeing any kind of investment come into their neighborhood. So not only did industry and taxes start to leave Chicago, and now you own a house in the south side of Chicago, but there's no more money coming into your neighborhood. So people aren't able to start a business. They're not able to start a grocery store. So now you don't have any money circulating around your neighborhood. So now it's all dependent on you having a job outside of your neighborhood. And that can very strongly affect not only the morale, but the economy of your neighborhood. Another reason that you had, so that was a big reason that there weren't a lot of Black owned businesses inside of Black neighborhoods in the US. And then another reason was, and I just forgot it. There was another reason. Well, I'll email it to you when I remember. What's the other reason? Banks and I don't remember. There's a lot of other things that go into this. If we look at, like, if we were to do a whole study on the Black community and the Black economy in the US and like how the Vietnam War affected it, and how the war on drugs, which you have all watched 13th, so you should know that that war on drugs was kind of a thinly veiled way of attacking hippies and people of color, because you could no longer have laws that wrote in ethnicity. So now how are we going to take out these liberal hippies and these people of color that are stirring up problems? Well, let's just, instead of making it illegal to be an ethnicity, let's make it illegal. Let's target people with mass incarceration and with the war on drugs and et cetera, et cetera. You saw that all in 13th. Okay, so transnationalism, immigrants of any ethnicity don't simply arrive, settle, and start anew. Most immigrant groups maintain close ties with their country of origin, which might mean that some of the money from that neighborhood is going back in remittances. For example, in El Salvador and in Ecuador, those are two different countries whose main currency is the dollar bill. And so like if you go to the bank, if you go to the ATM in El Salvador, dollar bills will come out. And the main reason is because their economy is so weighted with remittances, meaning that there's people living here sending a lot of that money back to their families in El Salvador and Ecuador or somewhere like that. But then transnationalism can also lead to you have, let's say you're Chinese and you start like a store here, or you're Indonesian and you start a store here, and then your suppliers are the people that you knew back in Indonesia or in Malaysia or somewhere like that. And so now you have like the um, connection of, I'm selling stuff here, I need more production from you in Indonesia, and now you have like that kind of growth of two different economies as a result. Um, and so yeah, that's financial remittances, and then transnational business practices. So there we have remittances to the Philippines over here, and how much is coming out of that's the U.S. And then Canada. Filipino people aren't going to Canada, but there you go. I don't know. Is that Norway? It's Philippine. Is Norway full of Filipino people? Kind of looks like it. So circuit firms, those provide services in transporting or transmitting goods and services. Those are kind of what I was just describing. You know, you have a business, or you have, let's say I have to get money back to my family in El Salvador. There's going to be specific routes that I can get that money back. So that would be a circuit firm. Cultural enterprises, like I said, you're importing cultural goods or something. Either it's like a curiosity here where you're like, oh, look at all this Indonesian made artwork or whatever, or there's people living here from your home country, and what they want is their magazines, their music, things that they can't necessarily get here that remind them of home, right? Their food. Yeah, so ethnic enterprises, like I said, that supplies things like food and clothing from home, things that like you can't necessarily get here that are familiar to you. And then return migrant micro enterprises. So those are people who return to their home country and utilize the contacts they made here. So one is we have people who might open a store here and they're utilizing their contacts back in their home country in the Philippines. And then you have people who eventually go back to the Philippines, maybe open up their own business, and they're utilizing their contact here. See the way that works? Okay. And that's it. So please watch the TED Talks that I included with, so those are all on Canvas. They have to do with race and ethnicity and schools and stuff like that. And they go along with the same stuff that I've been talking about. And next week I will post something on gender. And please let me know if you have any questions, and take care. I miss you guys. Okay, how do I stop this?